Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hello, friends. Do you know what would be one of the best things that could happen in the entire world? That would be if you would follow me on Instagram or Facebook. That would make angels sing, lonely kittens find a new home, and dinosaurs to come back. So please follow me on Health, Psychology, and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook. Hello, friends, and welcome to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. A science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. How ought one to live? What is human nature? Why are habits important? Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas was thinking about these topics centuries ago. In this episode, Professor Thomas Spalding teaches about the Aristotelian-Thomistic view about the human person and its view on the good life, human growth, and development. To learn more, read the book The Human Person, What Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas Offer Modern Psychology. Thomas Spalding is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. His research focuses on the psychology of concepts and the relation between the human conceptual and language systems. He is the author of over 65 journal articles and book chapters. Friends, please enjoy. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure having you here. I'm excited to talk about the book that you wrote with some other authors as well.
Yep.
And the book is called The Human Person, What Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas Offer Modern Psychology. And I thought of if we could just start off by talking about these two interesting figures. So who was Aristotle?
So Aristotle is a Greek philosopher. So he lived about roughly 2,400 years ago. And he is, in many ways, the foundation point for lots of areas of both philosophy, but also what we would now think of as modern science. So his philosophy was not just about things like logic and ethics and things like that, but also politics and rhetoric and physics and biology. So he's a starting point for a lot of what we now think of as any kind of intellectual endeavor. So he's a real foundational figure.
Right, and he was quite broad, right? He was interested in a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean he did everything from investigating the development of fetuses in various animals, all the way to, of course, what we sort of most famously know him for is things like logic and metaphysics and that sort of stuff.
Right. And what would you say? Like what is he mostly known for?
It depends on what area I think you're interested in. He's famously known for his work in politics. Probably most generally, I would say he's known for his work on logic, because he codified the beginnings of logic. So things like syllogisms, the sort of thing where you reason if A, then B, A is true, and therefore you can conclude that B is true. So he's probably most known for that kind of work.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And then Thomas Aquinas, is that how you say it, or how do you say it?
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas is normally the pronunciation in English, but of course he was actually Italian, so it would be Thomas d'Aquin, or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
However you want to say it.
Yeah.
And Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican priest. He was a philosopher and a theologian. And he lived between about 1175 and 1225. So there's a long gap between Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And one of the things that's really interesting in the history of this is that Aristotle's work sort of disappears in Western Europe. And that's because of the fall of the Roman Empire. So the Western Empire falls, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, stays around for quite a long time. And then what happens is that Aristotle's work gets taken up by the Arabic philosophers, and it actually migrates all the way around through the Middle East, across North Africa, and then it comes back into Spain in around the kind of 1100, early 1100-ish sort of era. And in Spain, there are a number of Moorish, so Islamic philosophers, Jewish philosophers like Maimonides, and Western folks who were working in Latin. And so Aristotle's work comes back through this long chain of commentary, and then it gets retranslated into languages that were available in Western Europe. And so Thomas Aquinas, along with his teacher, was a fellow named Albert, called the Great, Albert the Great.
That's a good name.
So you can see he was pretty important. He was Thomas Aquinas' teacher.
Yeah.
And so Thomas begins to take up Aristotle as one of the first people who can really get a handle on what Aristotle was up to. And Thomas brings back all of that work, all of that wisdom from the philosophy of Aristotle, and he combines it with the kinds of streams of philosophy that were then current in Western Europe. And so those are mostly things that come from Plato via Augustine. And so Thomas creates this quite impressive synthesis of different kinds of streams from Greek philosophy. And then he kind of puts this all together into one package. And that is in a sense the primary way that we get Aristotle's work into kind of Western Europe.
That is very interesting. So it was kind of because of Thomas that Aristotle became a big part of our philosophical traditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's very interesting. And so the book, as I mentioned, is about the Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas view of the human person. So what would you say, like, what is the Aristotelian-Thomistic view of the human person?
Okay, so the thing that we're really interested in the book is when we look at modern psychology, and so I'm a cognitive psychologist and I've taught, introductory psychology like 50 times or something over the years. And so what you see is that if you're a student and you're taking psychology, there's no real kind of coherent picture of what a human is like when you end your first year course in psychology. There's all these different kinds of psychologies, but there doesn't seem to be any obvious way that they all tie together, right? And this is not a unique observation from us. Every psychologist, I think, knows this, and people write papers on it every few years and complain about it. So we're in a good tradition in that sense. And what we did is the four of us all had other interests in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. So we had been looking at Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas for other purposes, and we thought, one of the things that's really impressive when you read Thomas Aquinas, for example, Aristotle's a little harder to read, actually. Aquinas is it's closer to our own time. It's a little easier to understand, and the writing is actually more polished. Just a little side note here. It turns out that a lot of what we think is Aristotle's writings might not be things that Aristotle himself actually wrote. They might be kind of like class notes or lecture preparation or something like that. They weren't really so compared to, say, Plato's books are extremely well written. They're very clearly written and polished for an audience. And Aristotle's writing is a lot more kind of cryptic. It's a lot more like a set of lecture notes or something where if you had the person there to explain it to you, that would be really helpful.
Right.
And so Thomas Aquinas, now his stuff is written, it's polished, it's very, very precise. He's writing most of these things as kind of like manuals for advanced students of philosophy and particularly theology. So he's very, very careful about drawing distinctions and being very precise about things. So he's a little easier to get a handle on what's going on. But one of the things that's really impressive when you read these guys is they have an enormously coherent view, not just of the human person, but of kind of everything. How the human person relates to everything else. And the reason why that is that Aristotle and following Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, they start with very basic metaphysical principles and problems. And everything from that basis is building up. And so they don't really introduce very many new principles along the way. And so when you see kind of how they think about a human person, what you see is that they're using the same principles that they used to talk about other animals, dogs, or plants, or rocks, or anything. So there's this coherence, what I would call kind of a vertical coherence, from all the way from really basic metaphysics, all the way through everything that they say about how to live the good life. There's this coherence that goes through this way. The other thing that's really interesting about them is that they have what I call kind of a horizontal coherence, which is within their discussion of a human person. Again, they use the same kinds of principles. And so different aspects of the human person are largely explained in the same kinds of ways. So just to give an example of this, in modern psychology, you have kind of cognitive stuff, and then you have emotions, and nobody quite understands how those two things should go together. And the people who do cognitive stuff have a various set of principles that they use to explain things. And the people that do emotion talk about completely different kinds of stuff. And so it's very hard to bring those two things into alignment in ways that you can understand. Now, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, on the other hand, they don't really talk about emotions compared to cognition. What they have is they have cognitive powers, so your ability to know about things, and then they have your appetitive powers, the appetites. So that's the powers that get you to want things, that get you to go and do things, the motivators. And those two sets of powers work together all the time in everything that you do. And so there's a very, very kind of coherent way of putting those two together. And then the emotions actually arise when you get this intersection of appetites and cognitions, right? And so you have an appetite for, let's keep it simple, food. You're hungry. You want something to eat. Your cognitive powers identify something in the environment that says, hey, that would be a good thing to eat. So they work together and they want you to go eat this thing. But some bad person comes along and they won't let you eat the thing, right? And so now the emotion arises at that intersection where you've got the appetite saying, yes, I want to eat this. You've got cognition saying, yes, that's a good thing to eat. And now somebody's stopping you, right? And so you get angry. So the emotion arises with the fulfillment or not fulfillment of the appetites and the cognitive powers telling you why or why not that thing is not happening that you want to happen, or why that thing is happening that you want to happen. So the emotions now, instead of being something that is set against cognition, the emotions actually arise from the operations of both the appetitive powers and the cognitive powers. So this is what I mean when I say there's a kind of coherence horizontally, if you will, among the powers of the human person.
Right. So the big thing here is basically that they have a view that really is quite holistic of what a human person is, and that is something that we are lacking in general today. So that is kind of the big thing, right?
Yes, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. And then the other interesting thing is, well, there's lots of interesting things, I guess. But the other interesting thing is that they are quite explicit about what's called final causes, or sometimes it's called teleology. And what it means basically is that things are directed to particular ends. So you have an appetite for food. So the appetite is directed to eating something. And in a higher sense, that appetite is directed to your flourishing. That is, if you didn't have hunger, you would never eat anything and you would die. And that would not be very flourishing.
It's not.
And so that's a really important part of this whole notion that you have these powers and these structures in order to accomplish things.
Okay.
And the things that you're trying to accomplish, to the extent that they are genuinely directed to human flourishing, then that's what leads to a good life. And so to figure out what things are genuinely directed towards good ends, you obviously have to know something about ends, and you have to think about what's a good thing and that sort of stuff. And so for Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, the key thing about human nature, particularly for the concept of flourishing, which is what you want to get to here, the key thing is that you have to understand human nature and what it is that makes a good life for the human. Because the good life for a horse is not the same as a good life for a person. And so the key thing that they see there is this notion of rationality, that you have these intellectual powers that you can bring to bear to identify things like a good in the abstract. And that's really important because it allows you to properly organize different goods, right? So let's take, we'll stick with the example of hunger and eating something. So at a low level, at a sensory level, a body level, you're just hungry. You just want to eat, right? And that's a good thing because you need calories to survive, right? But let's say you're not so healthy, you're perhaps overweight, maybe you have diabetes, something like that. Well, now, just eating something, although that's good so you don't starve, it's not the best thing to do. The best thing to do is to eat something that's actually healthy for you, right? And so the key thing there is you have to have those intellectual powers to allow you to think about the long-term, what is good, which good is best for me right now in this situation, and so on, right? And so that's really the structure that leads in a very kind of abbreviated sense, although this has been a bit long. It's leads all the way from the very basic metaphysics through to what is a human, through to how can a human flourish. And so you get this very coherent building from the basic issues all the way through to the good life.
That is very interesting. So what you're saying is that it's important to understand human nature, and when we actually understand human nature, then we know what a good life is for a human being. Exactly.
Because otherwise you don't have any idea. Because different animals, and we are an animal clearly in the AT tradition. That's very straightforward. Each animal flourishes in its own way according to its own nature, and that's absolutely true of humans as well.
Exactly. That is very interesting. So like, what are the important things that are about us that we need to take into account?
Right. So the main thing that's different, I think, in the AT view is rationality. So that's what separates humans, by and large, from other animals, is the ability to think about abstract, universal things. And because that's part of our nature, then according to Aristotle, what that means is that the good life is going to involve using your rationality to identify the goods to pursue. And so in that kind of view, you spend your life looking for the right things to do. And that's a sort of an interesting point, because rather than thinking of the good life as a kind of state, I'm happy because I have X, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas thought of the good life in terms of a kind of ongoing project of identifying what you should be doing. So it's kind of a different view of what it means to have a good life.
It is, right? Because that is also, I think, something that is quite interesting. So it's not actually about the states that you're feeling right now. So it's not about having positive emotions and not having that much negative emotions, for example. It's more about becoming, like, growing as a person, right? It's more of that kind of thing when it comes to the AT view.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what somebody like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas would say is that the good emotions and the happiness of those states arises when you manage to live with virtue. When you manage to live this flourishing life as an ongoing thing, then most of the time you're going to be in a pretty good state. But it's not the state that drives that. It's the living in that way that drives it.
Right. So growing or living in a way that is good is something that leads to you having positive emotions and being in good states in general, not entirely or all the time, of course, but in general.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very interesting. And what you said before was that it's what separates us from other species is that we are more rational, that we have this prefrontal cortex, or which makes us being able to be rational. Could you explain, like, a bit more about, like, how a life of a human being, a good life or a life of a human being, differs from like a life of like a horse or a dog or some other species?
Right. So for people like Aristotle and Aquinas, the main difference is that we have what they call the intellect, and that's a very specialized and technical term in this philosophy, and it's important to understand it doesn't map on exactly to things like intelligence and that sort of stuff. So it isn't the kind of thing where you go, oh, other animals are dumb and we're smart and that kind of thing. It's sort of this technical term for the power that allows you to identify and grasp universal abstract concepts. And a classic example of this is triangle. So any particular existing triangle is going to have a particular thickness of lines. It's going to have a particular set of angles and so on. And that doesn't matter whether it's a triangle that somebody has drawn on the ground, or a block that's in the shape of a triangle, or whether it's an imagined triangle. You're imagining that triangle with some set of angles. All of those things have this characteristic of being specific. And what Aristotle and Aquinas explain is that the intellect is what allows us to think about triangularity per se. That is, just to know what it means to be triangular. And that seems like a kind of an odd and esoteric thing to worry about. But it's really important because the same thing is true of something like, say, good. So each of us knows specific goods. Ooh, I had some food. That was nice. We can imagine specific goods. But what that is not so helpful for is trying to figure out things like, well, what's the ultimate good? Yeah. That is, what should you go for above and beyond anything else that you've ever encountered? So that power of universalizing, that power of abstraction is actually very, very interesting and important. And on the one hand, we make this point quite a bit in the book, is on the one hand, this power is really important. It's what makes humans do things like write books and have Skype interviews and do all of these kinds of things. And yet, on the other hand, an awful lot of what we do in our daily lives as we're wandering around the world is really not involving the intellect very much. And so what that means is that the AT view doesn't have this kind of really strong sort of dichotomizing between humans and non-human animals. There's an awful lot of stuff that's going to be continuous between other animals and humans. And of course, every species has its own particular sets of powers and abilities and stuff. So it's, even just saying humans versus non-humans is kind of an odd thing to do in the first place, because each species has its own sets of powers. But the big distinction is between the sensory powers, the things that are tied to sensed specific individual things, and the intellectual powers, which can involve these kind of abstract things. And so that's what allows humans to conceptualize the good life as a thing, even though it's completely abstract and there's not a kind of a specific thing, and you don't really have like a mental image of the good life. I mean, you may have mental images of certain things that would be good and that sort of stuff, but you can't really imagine in that sense the good, because it is an abstract universal thing. And so that is what allows humans to use rationality to think about, what should I really be doing with my life?
Exactly. And but isn't that also something, now it just comes to mind, that also can create misery for us? I mean, that we have this intellect and this cognitive powers to be able to think about like what a good life is. But then also, I think perhaps that is also something that can create like misery for some people, because we don't know we don't really know what to do.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting about this kind of approach is if you're wrong about what makes the good life and you pursue that, you're in for a pretty rough ride. Whereas, you're not really going to encounter, say, a wolf that decides, I don't really feel like chasing critters and eating them anymore, right? I mean, the other animals, by and large, are not going to kind of make bad life choices, right?
Right. Yeah.
They sort of don't have that capacity, and so that's one of the points that the AT view makes, which is that in a sense, your flourishing is kind of on you, right?
Yeah.
Now there are lots of things, and there's lots of things that they're clear about. You need to be born into a relatively good family situation, for example. If you're not, then things are going to be hard. You need to be born in a political situation that has some stability to it, and if not, things are going to be hard, right? So they're really clear about the fact that there's lots of circumstances outside your control. But the other thing that's really interesting in the AT approach is that the virtues have a kind of dual existence. So a virtue is simply the way Aristotle described it, on the one hand, it's simply some kind of excellence. So you could imagine that there would be virtues related to athletic performance, so strength and speed and flexibility and balance and so on, right? So anything like that could be a virtue. Now, the kinds of virtues that they're, of course, really interested in are moral virtues, the virtues of how to live a life. But one of the things that's really interesting is that on the one hand, they're kind of an ideal. So let's take something like prudence, which is one of the really kind of master virtues in a sense. So prudence is it's described as an intellectual habit. So that's one thing to know about virtues, is that they're habits, and I'll come back to that point. But prudence enables a person to deliberate properly, to come to a good conclusion in a particular set of circumstances. So it's kind of a sort of related to, a modern person might think a little bit about wisdom in that kind of sense. And on the one hand, it's an ideal. So no individual actual existing person ever is going to make the right decision in every single circumstance, throughout their entire life, right? So it's an ideal in that sense. On the other hand, though, it's a habit. And the point about that is that it's a habit. It's something that you gradually learn to do over time, over repetition, over more situations where you work through those situations, right? It's not something that just sort of exists in you and you say, okay, I'm virtuous now, so I've got prudence, so I can make the right call in every situation. It's something that you do over time. You learn and you build those habits of virtue. Now, of course, if you're doing things that are vicious, that is, not following from virtue, but following from a vice, those also are habits, right? And so if you fail to be virtuous and you instead become vicious, that's also a habit. And so you can, in fact, develop a life that's very, very bad via the same mechanisms that you could have used to develop a life that's good. So there is, in this view, a lot of personal responsibility for how you go about your life.
So it's basically like having a goal and then working, like growing towards that goal in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
That is quite interesting. But the interesting thing is then, like, how did, like, the AT view or Aristotle come up with the different goals?
Right. So this is actually really an interesting point, right? What Aristotle did initially was he basically sat down and he said, okay, so if people are rational, if they have that ability, what would that mean for their behavior? And so he comes up with lots of different virtues, and there's the four that are kind of sort of critical interest is what are they're now called the Cardinal Virtues. I don't think they were actually called that at the time, but they're now kind of called the Cardinal Virtues. And this is prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. So prudence I talked about a little bit. That's the one that allows you to or that forms the habit of making kind of good decisions in particular circumstances. Justice is basically rendering to other people what those other people deserve, the rights that they have. Temperance is moderation in using pleasurable things. So, eating enough, but not too much, those kinds of things. And then fortitude is the fourth cardinal virtue. And fortitude is really important because fortitude is the habit of standing firm when things are not going well, or of working hard towards making things going well. So if you put those kind of four things together, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, you have someone who carefully makes decisions, taking into account particular circumstances, will stand by those decisions, will work towards those decisions, and will not put themselves massively above the concerns of others, but at the same time would not fail to put forward their own needs and their own rights. So that's kind of the structure of what Aristotle put together, and he did that basically from the notion of rationality. What would it be rational for a person to do? Now, he combined that with deep study of things like politics. So, how have different political groups organize themselves in order to facilitate the good life for their citizens? And so, of course, he sees in existing political groupings, he sees lots of problems and lots of things and says, okay, well, why would that be a problem? And then he sort of works backwards from those sorts of things and comes back to, again, virtues. And then underneath all of these virtues, these are kind of like categorical virtues in a sense, the cardinal ones. And then underneath those, they identify lots and lots of more specific kinds of virtues underneath each one of the cardinal virtues.
Right. So like he basically from all the things that he studied at the time when he was living, he came up with basically like, so these are great things for you, or it's great for a human being to be like this, and then it's really great to work to become more like this, basically. So that's kind of right.
Yeah, exactly. And then Thomas Aquinas, of course. Now, Thomas Aquinas is a theologian as well as a philosopher. And so Thomas has a bunch of additional stuff related to the so-called theological virtues. So those are religion things. We don't get into those in the book because, of course, we're looking more at the psychology thing. But he has an additional set of virtues. But the interesting thing is that he's proceeding from the same kind of Aristotelian principles, and he's simply adding in kind of revealed religion stuff, because obviously he's a Dominican priest, right?
Yeah, right.
So he's adding in theological virtues, and so those are things like faith and hope and that sort of stuff, and that's sort of outside our purview in the book. But the interesting thing is that he actually is using the same kind of approach and keeping all of the cardinal virtues, because they still have to be applied to matters of faith for Thomas. So it's actually really interesting how he holds on to those things, even as he goes kind of beyond, because of his own particular set of concerns and interests.
Right. I think it's quite fascinating, like in a way. So what Aristotle and Thomas also did is basically they're describing what is a good way to be for a human being, and then it's all about like trying to become more of that ideal in a way. Yeah,
exactly.
And then that is something that constitutes the good life. So like a life worth spending, or like an ideal life, is basically growing towards these ideals that they have been, or that they have found in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
That is quite interesting, and it's also interesting. I mean, this is something that is different from like hedonistic views of happiness, for example. That it's more about like more about the positive emotions and not having as much negative emotions. And that is also quite interesting. So it like the good life being more about growing and becoming than actually like experiencing, right?
Right.
Or is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that what they would probably say is that you can't get those experiences in the right way without the virtues. So you can be happy about something that turns out to be really bad for you. And if you were living a life of more virtue in their view, you actually probably wouldn't be happy about that thing, right? You would see uh-oh, this is nice at the moment, but it has bad consequences, right? And so their view would be both that hedonism can be really misleading
Yeah.
in that sense, but also that once you really do form these habits, then you start to properly want things, so that you don't want things that you kind of shouldn't have, and therefore over time, as you build the habit, it becomes less and less likely that the pleasure is going to be misleading, that it's more and more likely that you get the pleasure from the things that you're doing that are proper. And so you end up both with this life of getting better at things, but that means overall you're living better, and that means overall you're going to have a lot of good things happen to you. So and that you'll learn to deal better when bad things happen, I guess, is the other kind of side of that, right? Yeah. So it is very, very different from that kind of hedonistic view where the goal, in a sense, is just to have the pleasure and not to have the pain. It's really different in that sense.
Right. And if we would like relate this to something, or like to our lives today, like what would be a way that we could make use of their thoughts about like the good life today?
Right. Well, let me give you a kind of simple sort of example that maybe illustrates kind of what they're talking about. So one of the problems today for a lot of people is that our diets are very high in salt, let's say. Salt is really actually not so good for us beyond a certain level. Everybody needs a certain amount of salt, otherwise bad things happen. But most of us get a lot more salt than is actually good for us, okay? Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is that if you take people with a normal diet, they eat a lot of salt, you give them food that doesn't have much salt in it, they don't like it. It doesn't taste good. They're missing the salt. And salt is a flavor enhancer, right? So what's interesting about this is that your flavor, your taste for salt is itself a habit. So if you take people off of salt for some period of time, at first food doesn't taste good. And then they start to be able to taste the flavors of the food better and better and better. And then after a while, if you give them something that has the same amount of salt that they used to eat, it tastes terrible. It's way too salty. Okay. And so this is a sort of an example they might suggest of the kind of thing that they're thinking about. As you build a habit of virtue, then your desires actually come in line with your beliefs about what you should be doing. And so this is very different from there's a number of views of kind of human ethics that they're sort of like orders, right? Like your desires are to do X, but there's an abstract rule that thou shalt not do X, right? And the thing that's interesting about that kind of view is that then your appetites are always in opposition to what you believe about what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Right? So there's always this opposition, and they're kind of always fighting with each other. In the AT view, what happens is that over time, as you build the habit, the desires start to align with what you believe to be the right thing. Now, unfortunately, it can also go the other direction. So if you build a habit of vice, your desires become more and more vicious as well, right? So again, it's that you have to live your life in a way that leads you on one path or another.
Right.
But that's kind of the idea.
That is quite fascinating. So it's kind of doing what is good long term will make you like one example could be exercise. So if you're not exercising at all, when you start exercising, it might feel bad in the beginning, but you know long term that it will be good for you and that you will feel good. And after you've done it for a couple of weeks, the experience of exercising will be a good experience for you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the unfortunate flip side is that if you do things that are bad, you'll come to enjoy those too.
Yeah, yeah, true.
So because this is one of the really interesting points is they thought about habit itself a lot, and one of the things they said is, initially you try to do something and it's very difficult. And then you do it the second time and it gets a little easier. And when it gets easier, you get this kind of like, oh, that's good, right? You get this little reward feeling of, hey, that's not so bad. And then it just continues to do that. And so they actually have really a very interesting discussion of habit per se, like habit itself, talking about the kinds of effects that developing a habit has. And so it takes off. You don't have to work so hard to do something. You get actual pleasure from allowing that habit to kind of do its thing, if you will. You no longer have to push hard to get the habit, whatever that activity is, to kind of get it started. Like habits get to the point where they just kind of seem to start themselves.
Yeah.
So they have this really long discussion of habit as a thing, and the effects that habit has. And so that again, it's sort of it's one of these things where they have this underlying kind of principle that they've seen, and then they apply it to all of these other things, and they go, oh, wait a minute, this actually really makes a big difference for these kinds of issues.
That is very interesting. So Aristotle and Thomas was thinking about habits, how we could use habits to have better lives, basically.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so particularly for Thomas, of course, he's a theologian, right?
Yeah.
So he's looking at issues of sin, right? And why do people sin? And how responsible is an individual person when they do sin, and those kinds of issues, right? And he applies this whole kind of Aristotelian framework of habit to that kind of issue, right? And so he really develops these notions of habit and how just having the habit kind of affects you, because he's very interested in explaining and understanding that particular aspect that he of course thinks of as a vice, as a sin, and so he's really taking that notion from Aristotle and really developing it in a lot of detail. And it's one of the interesting things about working with Thomas is that you have to kind of separate out some of the things that he's going to discuss in a religious context, but the religious context isn't necessarily the key thing from our point of view. That from our point of view, what maybe is the key thing is the way he talks about how the habit is developing and that sort of stuff. So we kind of have to separate those things out. In a similar way, actually, I should mention this. You have to separate out. So Aristotle is a really interesting person, really smart, but he did live like 2,400 years ago. So there's lots of stuff he didn't know, and he illustrates philosophical principles with what was believed to be kind of science of the day, and lots of that stuff is wrong. So you have to you always have to separate out the principles from the particular examples and stuff that they were using, because of course it was a long time ago. So lots of the examples are wrong, and to our way of thinking, very weird. Some of them, really strange things, right? But you have to kind of get beyond that and think about the underlying principle.
Right. So what they did basically was they was trying to understand the human being. So taking us into account, like what are we and what is it that makes us have a good life? And then they found these different kind of, goals in a way, or like ways of being. And then they found ways of becoming that ideal. and then that is kind of so striving to, I guess, so from this understanding of what would be the best for us in the long term, and then striving towards that, like that is basically both of them perhaps thought of the good life.
Right. So the way Aristotle frames this is he starts by saying, what is the ultimate good for a human? That is, what would a human pursue beyond all other things? And his answer is human flourishing. Eudaimonia is the Greek term that he used. And basically the idea is that everything else you pursue with a goal of flourishing. But flourishing you pursue for its own sake. There's not something beyond flourishing that you are trying to get. You're trying to flourish just because you're trying to flourish. You're not trying to flourish for some other purpose, right? So human flourishing becomes the ultimate end. And then he asks the question, how do you get to this? And that's kind of how he gets the cardinal virtues. And then he sort of asks, okay, well, how do we specify those cardinal virtues? And he breaks them down into more specific virtues and so on. And then Thomas Aquinas takes that and says, this is true for the sort of purely human way of thinking, and then on top of that he sort of adds some other revealed religion things, but in terms of the sort of the pure human part of it, he really kind of adapts and explains and identifies specific examples of Aristotle's basic structure.
Right. But about the cardinal virtues again, so what is, like, let's say you have a human being who is working towards these cardinal virtues his or her entire life. So and then it's really about the path towards that, or like what is it that you're supposed to get when you've worked your entire life towards this, like what is it that you get, kind of?
Right. I mean, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Right. And fundamentally, they would tell you, Aristotle would tell you that your life is the reward.
Exactly. Yeah.
That you have lived this good life. Now, there are some other aspects of this, which Aristotle talks about sort of contentment in old age, that even though your body is failing, you're getting older, things are creaking when you get up in the morning and that sort of stuff, you still have the wisdom, you still have the contentment of having made good choices in your life and so on. So you still have all these things. So you get that kind of contentment as well. Now, Thomas, of course, would say, because again, he's also a theologian, so he would say, heaven, right? That's the thing. But he would also say, well, you're not going to get to heaven without having lived in some ways lives of virtue, right? And so it's an interesting mixture between those two people, because they come from very, very different eras, of course, and different kind of background assumptions in that sense.
Exactly. So it's kind of, there's kind of a blueprint for a good life. Kind of, if you do this, then you have a good life, which is not so much about the big experience. It's more about, this is like a good life for a human being. It's striving towards these ideals.
Yeah. And the other thing to remember, I guess, is this is actually kind of an important point, is that part of, for example, prudence is applying the good life, applying the virtues in your own particular circumstances. And so it's one of the things that people sometimes get hung up on in terms of thinking about virtues. So virtue ethics was not really a term that these folks used. It's a modern term that's been applied to this way of thinking in general. People have a problem sometimes with virtue ethics because they say, well, you're saying that there's human nature and that every human therefore has to live in exactly the same way and that sort of thing. And Aristotle was really, he was, well, like everybody else, of course, he's a little bit trapped in his own time and culture. I mean, we all are. But he was pretty clear about the fact that different kinds of things happen in different cultures, in different situations. It's not like there's one set of rules for everybody. There's a set of principles, but those principles always have to be applied in very particular ways, in very particular situations. So it's sort of important to kind of keep that in mind as well, because it's not that there's just one path for everybody. There sort of is in a very abstract kind of way, but the specific path is going to vary really dramatically for each person.
Right, because I mean, if we take in personality, for example, I mean, we do vary quite a lot from like person to person. Of course, we're mostly the same, but we also vary a lot. So, is that something also that is being taken into account here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's really interesting stuff for example, in Thomas's discussion again of sin and why do people sin and why do some people sin more than others and those sorts of things. So, he talks a lot about things like, two people may differ in terms of their response to something because, one may have a stronger intellect than the other, or one might have stronger appetite of one form or another than the other person. So he's very aware of those kinds of underlying differences. And, both he and Aristotle are aware of those kinds of differences, and both of them would sort of say, well, the thing about the virtues is that you do the best that you can in your circumstances, and so it's absolutely expected that people are going to vary pretty widely on all kinds of things, but they would, of course, caution people to remember that. Even if you have, let's say you're just born hungrier than other people, so you want to eat more. They would caution that yes, that's true, and you need to be aware of that, but you also need to recognize that the power of habit is very strong. They have this interesting phrase for habit, which they sometimes call second nature. So first nature is what you're born with. That's your first nature. But habit can become so strong that they call it second nature. In other words, meaning that habits can get to the point where they act almost as if you were born with that particular power, in a sense, right? So they have this very, very interesting and it's a very subtle set of thinking. I mean, our book is really just it's really just a kind of a teaser. Here's some interesting stuff that these guys said, and here's some areas of psychology that have some interesting potential parallels. But when you really get into the depths of this whole train of philosophy, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there.
And what is also, I think, what's quite interesting here is that it seems like it's a lot about like letting the intellect be the driver in one's life. So in a sense, finding the things that are good for us in the long term and then working towards those kinds of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, I think, in the sense that there's a huge amount of commonality between other animals and humans, right? But in this regard, the AT tradition is really all about trying to find the difference.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's interesting about that, of course, is that because they have that focus in this kind of stuff, which is probably more than anything else what people might know about this area. So people might be kind of aware of these sorts of virtue ethics ideas, much more than, say, the Aristotelian and Thomistic vision of, say, cognition, which is not really known at all. So people might be a little bit aware of this, and it gives a little bit of a mistaken view of the whole AT tradition, because for this particular kind of purpose, they're very interested in drawing the distinction between what a human needs to do and what other animals do. Right. So it's really key for this particular point, but for lots of other points, there's a lot more commonality. So it's kind of an interesting issue where you can, if you only know this, you sort of see them as saying, well, humans are just utterly different than any other kind of animal, right? Because on this particular point, humans have a very particular special kind of issue that they're dealing with. So it's kind of an interesting overall thing there.
Right. So that we aren't the same in a lot of ways, but we also have the ability to even talk about the good life, and to talk about abstract concepts, and to talk about ways of living, and that is something that differs. But there's a lot of stuff that is basically the same between us and a lot of other animals.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that they do is there's a distinction. So I talked about the intellect. The other powers are sensory. And so this is in the cognitive realm. This is, abstract concepts are the kind of the domain of the intellect. Everything else, everything you see, most of what you do as you kind of wander around the world dealing with things without thinking about them too deeply, everything that other animals can do, everything they can figure out is in the sensory powers. Yeah. And that division between intellect and sense is in the cognitive powers, but it's also in the appetitive powers. So you have all animals have all kinds of appetites for food and sex and water and certain amount of warmth and all those kinds of things, but also other things. So lots of other animals are curious, and so on. So they have lots of things like that. And then on the human side, you can have the will, which is the intellectual version of appetites. And that really is about looking for the good in various guises and in various situations. So you have this kind of cross-classification of sensory versus intellect and cognitive versus appetitive. And so it's the intellectual stuff is really the stuff that sort of separates the humans from other things. But there's an awful lot that's still in common.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was very interesting that they were also, if we could just spend a little bit more time on the habits, because I think that was very interesting, that both of them had a big interest in habits as a way also, of course, of getting closer to the good life. So could you tell us a little bit more about their thoughts of why habits were important?
So we'll take a little step back and think about what were Aristotle and Thomas kind of up to in a general sense. They were analyzing all things really, but in this particular context, humans, in terms of their powers, their abilities to do things, right? And humans have some really odd kind of characteristics when you start thinking about their powers, their abilities to do things. One thing that's odd is that humans do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So if you think about what ecologists or behavioral folk would say. They would say that humans have an enormously wide behavioral repertoire, right?
Yeah.
Other animals, by and large, they do relatively few things, pretty much, right? And humans do lots of things. So this is an issue if you're analyzing something in terms of its powers. The second thing that seems to be a little strange once you start looking at humans is that they seem to change their powers over time. So at one time, the power to do something may not be there at all, and then the power to do that thing is kind of weak, and then eventually the power to do that thing is actually quite strong, and eventually it gets so strong it's like it was there the whole time. That's that kind of second nature stage that I was talking about before. So when they look at the human and they see these things, they recognize that they need to have a good principled way of talking about why the human has all of these different powers, because otherwise they end up having to just have this weird thing that says, well, humans are somehow born to write books, but only some humans, and only at a certain stage, and like it gets really weird, right?
Yeah.
And they understood that. They saw this and went, well, okay, obviously there's got to be something else going on here, and that really kicks off the interest in habit, and then once they kind of have that idea, then of course it becomes, this is kind of a master key, in a sense, to understanding all of these changes that people undergo. And of course, so Aristotle, he applies this to teaching and learning and all kinds of things. It's not just about the virtues by any means. It's a really general principle, and they understood it that way. And so, that again that's sort of the way they work, in a sense, right? They identify general principles of things, and then they apply them in many situations. And so that's really where you need habit to come in, is to sort of make up for the fact that humans have all of these things as behavioral abilities, but they're not kind of coming into the world doing them.
We've been talking about quite a lot here. Is there something else that we missed that you would like to mention?
Let's see. Well, I think the other thing to mention in terms of this is that the virtues have to develop and be exercised within a society. So when we talk about the virtues, mostly we've been talking about the individual person. So the person creates a habit of doing something, and so on. But the other side of that is that the habits are fundamentally social, and so we have in our book, we have a sort of chapter on flourishing, and it's kind of immediately followed by the human in society, because the way that the virtues are going to develop depends pretty dramatically on your relations with other people, because the habits, the virtues themselves, have as a characteristic, most obviously, of course, justice, which is explicitly about other people, giving other people their due, their rights, but all the others are kind of fundamentally about making sure that you are working with other people. And so, Aristotle is kind of famous for calling humans, you define humans in two ways. One as a rational animal, and the other as the political animal. And so that gives you the two sides kind of what we've been talking about. The rational is what drives a lot of the internal things, the individual stuff that we've been talking about. But his analysis of the person as a political animal situates the individual within the larger kind of social context. And so there's a lot of stuff there that might be really interestingly developed. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, has large treatises on law. And those things are still studied to some extent today, but only kind of in law. They've kind of, all those ideas have kind of fallen out of psychology and social psychology. Aristotle, of course, talks about politics. He talks about rhetoric. So how is it that people convince other people of things, and how does that relate to virtues? So there's a lot of stuff there as well. There's a whole big structure of interesting things that psychology might also be interested in paying attention to.
Right, so it's really about the individual, but also about society and us working together in in these big groups.
Yeah.
What would you say is the main thing that they have to contribute when it comes to the political animal?
So the main thing I would say is probably a bit different from the way we tend to think now in the West, is that, as with everything else, they are interested in the end, that is the goal, in a sense. So they ask questions about, well, what's the goal of these political entities?
That's
right?
A big question. Yeah.
And so their answer is that the proper goal of any political entity is to encourage and set the stage for the development of the virtues of the members of that polity, of that political group. So that's a really interesting way, I think, of thinking about this, because I think the modern idea would be, what's the goal of a political group? Well, it's the well-being, in the sense of maybe financial well-being, maybe maybe safety and security, maybe something else. But that's not quite the same as saying that the goal is the development of virtue, right? That's a quite different potential way of thinking about group activity.
For sure. That is, so it's kind of them thinking, so this is the ideal way to live a life, and we want society to help people live their life in that particular way.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, this is another example of what I was talking about at the very beginning, of that kind of vertical coherence, right? Where right from kind of metaphysical principles to what's the nature of the human, to what's a good life, to how do we get to a good life, to what are our political units contributing to that, right? So it's that, again, you get that kind of coherence of the approach.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. That you what you just mentioned, and what you mentioned before. That it seems like, just as you said, that they really have this holistic view where all these different parts somehow is integrated. I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a bit of a different kind of viewpoint from kind of the modern world.
Yeah, but especially perhaps now that, I mean, wasn't it more often that one, didn't we have more polymaths before, people who were, knew a lot about a lot of different subjects? Today we're more specialized than we probably were back at Aristotle's time when he lived, or when Thomas lived as well.
Yeah. I mean, and part of that is just that, they had to, part of it is just a matter of time. There's only so much time in the day. And if you really want to be a particle physicist, you better put all your time pretty much on being a particle physicist. That kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But the other issue is that I think they didn't have anybody that they could turn to,
right,
to help answer those questions, right?
Yeah.
If they wanted to know something about politics, they had to think about politics, because there wasn't somebody else to turn to who was a specialist in politics. And so that it kind of encourages, to some extent, a way of thinking across boundaries.
Yeah, that's very true. yeah, they didn't really have Google back then.
That's right.
I mean, it really helps when you want to, and YouTube as well for everything. And, I mean, yeah, that's cool. Thomas, I've really been enjoying this. It's I think you really have a good way of making this. I mean, making us that doesn't know as much as you or helping us learn about this. So big thank you for contributing and teaching us about this stuff here.
Good. Well, I'm really glad. I'm always a little concerned about this because it's really complicated, and I'm not really a super specialist in this myself.
Oh, right.
So, I'm a psychologist, right? I'm not really a top of the line kind of philosopher sort of person. So I'm always a little concerned about that. But I'm glad that there's some things here, and I'm really encouraged because you've found this interesting, and that's really what we're trying to accomplish in the book is to get people to know that there's this other really interesting and quite different way of thinking about people that could really be interestingly brought into conversation with modern psychology. So that's really encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. So the book is called The Human Person, What Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas Offer Modern Psychology. So we'll just like to end with saying again, like big thank you for contributing and taking part.
Oh, thank you for contacting me. It's been a lot of fun.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care.